In most Anglo-Saxon common law countries like Canada, the UK, the US, shareholder interests are often seen as being the primary concern of directors, as long as the firm is a going concern, that is. Legally speaking, directors owe a duty of care and loyalty to the firm itself. But given that the interests of other economic parties are contractually protected, shareholders are often the first to bear losses and the last to receive compensation. And thus, jurisprudence in common law suggests that the shareholders ought to be treated as being of the greatest importance. Now, that said, there have been updates to this particular doctrine. Recently passed Bill C-97 in Canada allows for the directors of Canadian firms to consider the interests of other stakeholder groups in their decision-making. But this particular approach of shareholder supremacy has been quite popular. Nonetheless, it has faced a significant amount of criticism from economists and financiers who recognize that a focus on shareholders has turned into a focus on short-term profits for short-term investors. And as a result, firms who are focused on meeting the needs of short-term investors who are demanding quarterly profits arriving in an uninterrupted fashion tend to underinvest in long-term value-creating activities like product support, research and development, and maintaining sufficient equity buffers against bankruptcy. As a simple example of that, had General Motors not paid out as large a dividend between 2000 and 2008, had it paid out half of its dividends between 2000 and 2008, it would have had sufficient equity on its balance sheet to not require a bailout from the federal government as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. Instead, a focus on pleasing shareholders in the short term exposed the firm to massive losses, which ultimately had to be backstopped by the state. Now, to resolve this kind of problem where we focus merely on short-term ownership, a number of suggestions have been floated, such as taxing financial transactions to encourage longer holding periods and dissuade high-frequency trading, halting the practice of quarterly earnings guidance from firms, which is not actually legally required, despite the fact that as many as 80% of firms are engaged in providing these sorts of estimates to analysts. There have been suggestions, particularly one in France, about awarding more voting power to longer-term owners, and suggestions about how to improve the disclosure of profits and risks involved in long-term projects. One particularly interesting variation on this notion of shareholder supremacy occurs in Japan and South Korea, but with a bit of a twist. In these countries, we see groups of companies acting to coordinate their efforts together rather than competing as single atomized units. This system in Japan, called the Keretzu System, or the Chaebol system in Korea, was originally based out of Japanese geography. Japanese geography is particularly mountainous, and throughout the centuries, it very quickly developed into a series of conflicts between the inhabitants of one valley or another, with particular clans rising to control these valleys and ultimately engaging in clan-based competition. After the Meiji Restoration, what we see is the rapid industrialization of Japan, and as a result of its geographic heritage, Japan's path through industrialization followed a similar path, leading to clan-based keiretsus, originally zaibatsus, who controlled a significant part of the industry of the entire country. Now, after Japan was defeated by the Americans in World War II and the Chinese as well, it's worth noting that they were forced to retreat from Korea, leaving behind entirely all of the factories and in the industrial model that they had brought during their colonization period. The Koreans quickly adapted the model itself and these corporations, and by the 1960s, we see the beginnings of the Chaebol system, which is, interestingly enough, a little bit closer to its original Zaibatsu source code than the Keiretsu of modern Japan. Modern Japanese Keiretsus are a slight variation on the family-controlled theme by the fact that the families who controlled them were forced to divest after World War II, when the Zaibatsus were dismantled by the American Occupation Administration. However, once the war in Korea emerged in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Americans found that they had a need for a local industrial plant to supply their war effort, and as a result, the Japanese industrial system was rehabilitated. However, with one key change. Rather than turning the companies back over to their founding families, as would have been a simple resurrection of the Zaibatsu system, ownership of these companies was opened up to the public. And this is what separates the modern Keretzu system in Japan from the chaebol system that dominates in Korea. In Korea, the chaebols are still largely controlled by their founding families, whereas in Japan, the authority of the family has been somewhat diluted over time. This has not been a complete dilution, but the chaebols often have much more power reserved for the founding or controlling families than the keretsus of current Japanese industry. Another interesting model for us to consider is one which emerged in continental Europe, in Germany, in 1870. With the creation of the company law in Germany at the time, a dual board structure was created. There is an executive board that works to coordinate internal executives to the company, effectively managing its day-to-day business. But there's also a supervisory board that oversees the functioning of the executive board, to whom the executive board is accountable. In this supervisory board, anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the seats, depending, of course, on firm size, are actually allocated to the firm's employees, recognizing their contribution of labor capital to the value created by organizations. Now, this type of governance concept was pretty well received and spread throughout much of Europe over the last century and a half, as governments and firms found that it was valuable to engage other stakeholders in the governance process. In this case, what we see is that there is less of a friendship bias when it comes to appointing other members of a corporate board. Usually in a shareholder-based system, we see that shareholders end up free riding on one another and not paying close attention to who their directors are or holding them to account, which often leads to patronage when in the form of board appointments, where allies of executives or allies of existing board members are simply promoted into place. Meanwhile, in the continental model, we find that this is actually much more difficult, that rather than simply using board seats as a form of patronage, when it comes to supervisory boards, we actually see that labor takes a very strong position on exactly who is going to be responsible for allocating resources within the organization. There have been some interesting sorts of results from this deep involvement of labor in corporate governance. For instance, the use of short-time programs during recessions. Rather than laying off, say, 10% of the workforce when there's a 10% decline in demand, as is common in Anglo-Saxon governed firms, continental firms actually reduce the number of hours for all laborers in place of these kinds of selective layoffs to help avoid the loss of skills during a period of unemployment, potentially a loss of valuable employees to other firms, and of course, the undermining of morale for those employees who remain. The link below from Landing gives a little bit of a deeper insight into some of the advantages that these kinds of models present. They are certainly not without their costs. We find that continental model firms are slightly less dynamic and do have to take into account the view of employees, meaning, of course, that firms simply aren't as quick to lay off or let go of employees in their quest for restructuring. But there's a far more interesting version of employee engagement, which is often neglected in many business schools. And this is the governance form of a worker cooperative. While often many people believe that the cooperative movement arose from the Industrial Revolution's push for labor rights, in fact, its pedigree is much older and far more distant. Despite the fact that Europeans did have a labor movement and did push for the development of co-ops in the mid-19th century, we actually see worker co-ops predating them by several centuries. The most interesting example of this are what were called the Kongsi, which were originally worker collectives in which members were able to share in the gains and losses of a collective enterprise. Originally, this type of model of worker governed enterprises had its roots in the Liu Chao, or the Six Dynasties period, when a number of Confucian leaders tended to expel merchants from northern China, pushing them south across the Yangtze River. And this helped to blend with the local sort of Yue cultures from earlier that had been particularly commercially oriented, in contrast with the agricultural aspects of what we see in the Yellow River Valley. Now, the Kongsi first start to develop formally about 1100 AD in Yunnan province, where there are collectives of miners hoping to escape the immediate authority of the Southern Song, who were quite engaged at that point in time with battles with the Jin and later on the Mongols, who would become the Yuan dynasty. But these types of small mining cooperatives were ultimately governed originally by family connections. Later, however, they spread to include wider degrees of affiliation, usually focused on which home port people were from and which language dialect they spoke. As imperial forces tended to push southward into the southern Song territories, seeking a broader alignment of the entire empire towards more land-based objectives, what we see is a lot of the commercially minded coastal peoples moving abroad, creating what was called the overseas Chinese community that is even today found well across the first island chain, you might call them, everywhere from Taiwan down through the Philippines into Borneo and all the way to Indonesia and Malaysia. So these originally worker cooperatives ended up growing in some cases into very sophisticated micro-states, sometimes referred to as Kongsi republics. Some of them had their own private armies, provided educational services to their workers, health services, and some even issued their own currencies. What's particularly interesting about Kongsi governance is that originally the leaders of Kongsis would be selected by the workers themselves, of course, and they would serve for relatively short terms, after which they were not eligible for re-election and would simply get back into the mine with all the other workers. The average tenure in many of these Kongsis for leaders was approximately 3 months, giving widespread opportunities for a number of people to participate in governance and maintaining a direct accountability between management and labor. It's worth noting that in time, the Kongsi shifted away from being pure worker cooperatives, such that by about the middle of the 19th century, after a series of difficult conflicts with Dutch colonists, the Kongsi began to incorporate more investment from passive private investors and moved away from a model that was purely based on worker cooperatives. Those which did survive this sort of changeover, though, often grew into some of the large multinational corporations that we see operating around the South China Sea. Now, centuries later, and at the far end of Eurasia, we see the emergence of a group called the Rochdale Society of Equitable Partners, sometimes referred to as the Rochdale Pioneers. The only reason they are particularly relevant in history is not because they are the first worker co-op, but because they provided organizing principles to help develop other kinds of worker co-ops. And these principles, the Rochdale principles, have been widely spread around the world in the last 170 to 180 years. Particularly interesting has been that research has revealed certain advantages of this particular governance model, despite the fact that it remains underexposed and underutilized. Perhaps one of the most modern successful examples of a worker cooperative is the Mondragon Group from Spain, which currently has over 150,000 employees around the world who own their own organization. It's been particularly beneficial for the employees who own the firm, as well as various other stakeholders. Of particular note has been Mondragon's success in spreading their model internationally, and therefore it's probably worth spending a little bit of time to try to understand the relative advantages of worker cooperatives rather than simply assuming that a shareholder-led model of corporate governance is the one that would create the most value for the firm's stakeholders.